Bruce Lee faced 6 black belts at once. In 12 seconds, the gym became silent in shock. They said the room went quiet before anyone understood why. 6 trained men had stepped forward together, confident in number, rank, and reputation. 12 seconds later, no one moved, and no one spoke. Not because of injury, not because of fear, but because something they believed about strength had just been removed cleanly without spectacle. Those who were there would later agree on only one thing. The outcome felt inevitable, as if the moment had been decided long before the challenge was spoken. The gym was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not empty. Sunlight filtered through high windows, dust motes drifting lazily over polished wood floors. Each corner of the room carried memory. The faint scuff of shoes from years of sparring, the subtle marks where bodies had collided, and the worn edges of equipment that had absorbed decades of disciplined motion. It was a space that remembered, and it remembered reputation. Bruce Lee entered with his usual calm, unhurried, scanning the room without a hint of pretense. He did not announce himself, nor did he posture. The black belts were already there, 6 men in total, each a figure of authority in their own right. Their belts gleamed under the sunlight, a visible symbol of hours and years of discipline, of skill tested in countless controlled environments. Yet the weight of that history, of that authority, would matter less than any of them imagined. Observers lined the walls. Students who had trained under these black belts recognized the tension immediately. They were not witnessing a match. They were witnessing a public reckoning, a convergence of philosophies. On one side, tradition, methodical, hierarchical, carefully measured. On the other, Bruce Lee, minimal, efficient, a visible calm that did not challenge loudly but contained a quiet certainty. No one spoke at first. The only sounds were the subtle shifting of bodies, the faint scrape of canvas on wood, and the distant hum of the street outside. Even in silence, the room carried its history. Every corner, every mark, every echo was testimony to authority. Yet in the stillness, it was clear that authority alone was not enough to dictate the coming outcome. As Bruce Lee moved toward the center, the black belts formed a semicircle, their spacing precise, a reflection of their confidence and their training. Each knew the other's strengths, their tendencies, their timing. This was not chaos. This was structure, meticulously maintained for years. And yet, despite that order, an undercurrent of anticipation ran through the room. Not for spectacle, not for a fight, but for the question everyone silently carried. What happens when precision meets absolute efficiency? Bruce did not make a sound. He did not take a stance meant to intimidate. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. The observers noticed it first as a subtle slackening of posture among the black belts. The almost imperceptible hesitation in their weight distribution, the slight narrowing of their gaze. They had expected an exchange, a struggle, a challenge to be measured in effort. Instead, they were confronted by certainty, something outside the rhythm they had internalized. It was in this room, rich with history and reputation, that the first thread of inevitability appeared. The room did not hum with energy. It held it in suspension. Time slowed, not because the moment was extraordinary, but because the environment itself, layered with authority and expectation, now awaited a demonstration that would quietly unravel it all. The witnesses would later recall that even before the first movement, something had already shifted. The room, carrying decades of earned respect and rigid hierarchy, sensed that method alone would not dictate the outcome. The hierarchy was intact, yet fragile, and Bruce Lee's calm was a question that could not be ignored. Here, in this room, the stage was set, not by gesture but by presence, not by sound but by the weight of watching eyes. And in that stillness, the inevitability of what was about to unfold had quietly, irreversibly, taken hold. The challenge did not begin with words. It began with recognition. The black belts, confident in their combined experience, did not shout, did not gesture. They simply acknowledged Bruce Lee's presence with the same quiet formality they would extend to any serious practitioner entering the room. It was enough. In that acknowledgement lay the silent agreement. A demonstration would occur, and the stakes were implicit, not declared. No one needed to explain why. The gym, steeped in tradition, already held the unspoken rules of engagement. A confrontation here was not personal. It was public but measured. Each man understood that the purpose was not spectacle, nor was it a contest of pride. It was a verification of principle. And in principle, Bruce Lee's methods challenged theirs in the most basic, undeniable way. Observers watched as Bruce moved, not toward aggression, but toward clarity. His eyes scanned each of the 6 men in turn, noting stance, balance, and positioning with an almost imperceptible tilt of the head. There was no tension in his shoulders, no exaggeration in his movements. Each gesture was minimal but deliberate, as though he were mapping the space and the intention of every opponent simultaneously. The black belts, in turn, maintained their formation, a semicircle that symbolized both unity and confidence. They had trained together for years, reinforcing each other's strengths, compensating for weaknesses. In their methodical way, they believed that number, rank, and coordination would overwhelm any single challenger. They had faced skilled individuals before, but never someone who moved with this economy, who carried no visible preparation yet projected the inevitability of precision. The challenge was now formed, but it existed in silence. No rules were read aloud. No ceremonial gestures were required. Each participant knew the limits of the space, the expectations of conduct, and the ultimate question. Would Bruce Lee's method, minimal yet complete, prove sufficient against 6 experienced black belts acting as one? It was an unusual tension, because no one raised a voice. There was no hype, no dramatics. The energy came from observation, the weight of collective expectation. Students leaned slightly forward. Instructors crossed arms quietly. The room had contracted, drawing all attention to the center where presence alone had become the signal for engagement. In these moments, the black belts were already testing themselves psychologically. Each subtle shift of Bruce Lee's body forced them to reassess assumptions. Speed versus reaction, economy versus elaboration, intent versus display. There was no rush, yet every second carried implication. Their hierarchy and experience had prepared them for skill, for confrontation, but not for the form of control they now faced. The challenge existed, fully formed, without a word exchanged. It was not a provocation. It was a verification. Bruce Lee had not demanded it, nor had the black belts imposed it. The room itself, shaped by years of authority and observation, had constructed the moment. And in that construction, the inevitability hinted at in the first chapter deepened. The outcome was no longer uncertain, even if the method remained unseen. The observers understood, even before any movement began, that this would not be a typical demonstration. The question was no longer, who will win? The question had quietly shifted. What will remain of what we believe about skill and control when it is confronted by the unseen efficiency of one man? The moment before contact was measured not in seconds, but in attention. Every pair of eyes in the room had become an instrument, observing, calculating, and absorbing. Students halted their practice mid-motion, leaving the floor almost unnaturally still. Instructors, who had spent decades reinforcing hierarchy and discipline, stepped back slightly, their silence a signal that the space now belonged to the unfolding principle, not to anyone's authority. The black belts remained in formation, each aware of the other's positioning, yet subtly sensing the tension that was not theirs alone. They had faced skilled opponents before, men of strength, speed, and technique, but never someone whose movements suggested nothing yet implied everything. Bruce Lee did not prepare theatrically. He prepared psychologically. His stillness alone unsettled the assumptions they had carried for years. From the edges of the room, the witnesses felt the shift in real time. It was quiet, almost imperceptible. The fractional hesitation in a step, the slight pause in a breath, the unspoken recalibration of spacing. Nothing had been tested physically yet. And yet the energy in the room had already begun to change. It was no longer a demonstration of ability, but a study in anticipation and control. The observers would later recall that it was the tension of expectation that dominated the space. The human mind, trained to expect confrontation as a spectacle, found itself stripped of conventional cues. There were no shouts, no dramatic bows, no ceremonial posturing. Just presence, observation, and the implicit acknowledgement that the known order might not suffice. In that quiet, Bruce Lee became a lens for the room's perception. Each black belt, despite confidence in skill and training, experienced a subtle dislocation. They were strong, fast, and practiced, yet each microsecond of delay revealed a gap, not in strength but in assumption. What they thought was control was only potential. The room, silent and attentive, absorbed the lesson before a single movement had landed. It was in this psychological compression that Bruce's advantage had already begun to manifest. The black belt's awareness expanded outward, encompassing not just themselves, but each other, each student, and the watching instructors. Every eye carried weight. Every measured breath added tension. The anticipation became its own instrument, amplifying the inevitability that had begun in Chapter 1. By the time Bruce moved, the observers were not watching a fight. They were witnessing the subtle disassembly of confidence, the quiet recalibration of expectation. The weight of watching eyes had transformed from passive observation into active pressure, compressing the hierarchy of authority and challenging the collective assumptions of 6 skilled men. And in that compression, the room itself seemed to pause. It was no longer a gym. It was a chamber of observation, a laboratory of perception, and the outcome had already begun to assert itself quietly, inevitably, without spectacle. When Bruce Lee moved, it was nearly imperceptible at first. Not a flurry, not a feint, just a shift of weight, the smallest pivot of a foot, and the tiniest adjustment of his center of gravity. The 6 black belts reacted simultaneously, instinctively, in the rhythm they had drilled for years. Yet each of their reactions was subtly incomplete. Not because of hesitation, but because the cues they relied on, the visible preparation, the telegraphed intention, simply were not there. The engagement lasted no longer than 12 seconds, but in that brief interval, every expectation was tested. Hands that would have blocked, deflected, or intercepted found themselves meeting empty space or arriving too late. Bruce's movements were not designed to overpower. They were designed to interrupt, to redirect, to neutralize intent before it could fully manifest. And in that economy, there was no drama, only clarity. Observers noted that no one was thrown violently, no one struck in anger. There were no shouts, no displays of strength, no exaggerated postures. The room held its breath as the black belts attempted to assert control, only to realize that the foundation of their confidence, the assumption that skill could be measured by repetition and rank, was not sufficient against someone who had distilled movement to its essential, effective form. It was not a spectacle of dominance. It was an illustration of inevitability. Bruce Lee's precision created micromoments where decisions were rendered irrelevant. The black belt's strength and coordination were intact, yet each motion they initiated was met with minimal but decisive redirection. The observers could see it unfold with clinical clarity. 6 men, trained and disciplined, operating in concert, yet unable to impose their structure on one individual who had already removed the friction from the system. In those seconds, the gym became silent not from awe, but from the undeniable observation of principle in action. The lesson was not in the physical victory, it was in the absence of struggle. Bruce's efficiency demonstrated what he had long emphasized in training: economy of motion, clarity of intent, and mastery of timing. The confrontation was complete not because anyone fell or conceded, but because the assumptions underpinning hierarchy had been quietly, but thoroughly, dismantled. The black belts, though physically unharmed, experienced a subtle psychological shift. Their coordinated confidence, built over years of disciplined practice, had been rendered provisional. And in that realization, the room felt a pause, a suspension between what was done and what had been understood. The demonstration concluded, not with a declaration, but with an almost imperceptible release of tension. No one spoke. No one moved immediately. Even the air seemed heavier, as though the room itself was absorbing the precision it had just witnessed. The demonstration had been brief, restrained, yet irreversible in its effect. The observers, who had expected a contest of skill, instead saw the quiet dismantling of assumption. And that silence, that stillness, marked the true measure of the moment. The black belts stood, each in their position, their bodies intact, yet their certainty fractured. They had not been defeated by force. There were no injuries, no dramatic collapses, no visible humiliation. What they faced was subtler, more unsettling. The quiet removal of confidence itself. The assumptions they had carried, the belief that experience, coordination, and rank guaranteed control, had no purchase in the presence of Bruce Lee's minimal, exact efficiency. Observers later recalled a peculiar kind of silence. It was not awe nor fear. It was recognition. The 6 men were experienced enough to see, in retrospect, how each micro-movement had been anticipated, each line of attack neutralized, each potential advantage minimized. Their physical ability remained. What had eroded was the certainty that skill could be measured solely through repetition, hierarchy, or numerical superiority. Psychologically, the shift was immediate. Where there had been confidence, there was now recalibration. Each man instinctively searched for a foothold in a method that had already bypassed it. They had expected struggle, expected resistance, expected display. What they encountered was the quiet inevitability of mastery, so precise and restrained that it left no room for debate, only observation. The observers, too, felt the subtle impact. They saw that control does not always present as force, and that authority does not always assert itself through volume or aggression. In those brief moments, the black belt's assumptions had collapsed, and the room itself absorbed the lesson. There was a collective understanding that would not be spoken aloud for years. Skill measured by hierarchy and repetition is fragile when confronted with clarity and efficiency distilled to their purest form. Bruce Lee stepped back without haste, his expression unchanged. There was no triumph, no assertion, no gesture toward victory. The room, thick with the quiet weight of understanding, remained still as the observers and the 6 men processed what had just occurred. The psychological impact was complete, the physical aftermath irrelevant. It was not a matter of pride lost or won. It was a matter of realization. Methodical confidence, when untested against minimal, decisive efficiency, could find itself unexpectedly vulnerable. And in that quiet recalibration, the legacy of the moment began to form, not in headlines, nor in spectacle, but in the minds of those who had witnessed the dismantling of certainty without struggle, and who would carry that understanding forward. The room exhaled collectively, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. What had seemed like a simple demonstration had quietly dismantled assumptions and rebuilt them in the form of quiet respect, for clarity, restraint, and the psychological mastery that operates beneath the surface of visible action. Years later, the story of that 12-second confrontation had settled into legend, not because of spectacle, but because of the quiet authority it demonstrated. Those who were present did not speak of Bruce Lee as a man who defeated 6 black belts in the traditional sense. They spoke of him as someone who revealed a truth about skill, control, and the weight of presence. The event became less about victory and more about observation, a moment that continued to teach without words. The black belts themselves carried the memory differently than outsiders. Each had retained physical skill, yet the understanding of method, hierarchy, and authority had been irrevocably altered. In subsequent years, they trained with a new lens, questioning assumptions, searching for efficiency where previously they had only enforced structure. What had been a brief public challenge became an internal guide, shaping how they approached instruction, coordination, and even patience in sparring. Students who had watched that day remembered the subtle signals long after the excitement of youth faded. They recalled the absence of struggle, the quiet dismantling of confidence, and the inevitability in Bruce Lee's movements. They carried those lessons forward not as slogans, but as a lived understanding, that mastery could exist quietly, efficiently, and without aggression. It informed the way they moved, the way they observed, and the way they measured skill, not by demonstration of power, but by precision of intent. The gym itself, once only a space of competition and hierarchy, became a place of reflection. Teachers began to emphasize clarity over ceremony, minimalism over display. Bruce Lee's presence that day had shifted the environment permanently. Not through intimidation, not through spectacle, but through a demonstration so complete in its simplicity that it could not be forgotten. Even decades later, those who were there would recount the silence that followed the 12 seconds. They spoke of the calm, of the absence of theatrics, and of the certainty that had been conveyed without a single shouted command. The lesson endured. Efficiency, control, and psychological mastery leave traces far longer than force or aggression. And in this way, the incident became legend. Not as a story of beating 6 men at once, but as a living example of how mastery, applied with precision and restraint, reshapes perception, method, and understanding. The room, the people, and even the observers carried the memory quietly, teaching future generations that the weight of authority lies not in noise or numbers, but in clarity, inevitability, and restraint. Long after the echoes of that day had faded, the story remained. Not as spectacle, not as hype, but as a slow, steady testament. Skill, when distilled to its essential form, can transform the world around it without ever raising its voice. And in that transformation, the true measure of mastery is found.